Harold Rowe, a 73-year-old veteran of the Vietnam War, lived in quiet solitude in a weathered home on the edge of a Kansas prairie. His house, modest and aged, echoed with the silence of years gone by. He woke each day before the sun, brewed black coffee in an old tin kettle, and sat at a wooden table that bore the weight of time and memory. His fingers would find the carved letters, Leland Rowe, etched decades ago into the soft grain of the wood. His younger brother's name. This table had once been their playground of ideas, where they played chess, wrote letters, read comics, and shared stories as the world outside moved obliviously forward. In Harold's heart, time had stopped the day the military notified him that Private Leland Rowe had gone missing in action. To most, the war was history. But to Harold, it was an unfinished conversation, a fog that never fully lifted. He still heard the sound of helicopters in the distance, still smelled the acrid smoke of gunfire, and still saw Leland's wide, eager eyes the last time they said goodbye. His brother was only 19. And Harold had promised their mother that he'd bring Leland back home, no matter what. On the mantel above the fireplace, a few black and white photographs remained as testimony to the past. One showed Leland holding a fishing pole, barefoot, grinning beside a muddy Kansas creek. Another captured both brothers in army uniforms, side by side, the older Harold with a protective hand on Leland's shoulder. Harold often found himself speaking aloud to these photographs, sharing morning thoughts, asking questions he knew would never be answered. These weren't moments of madness but of longing. In solitude, Harold's dialogue with memory became a kind of ritual, an emotional echo chamber. Every Saturday, Harold visited the town's Veterans Hall. Not to play cards or chat about politics like the others, but to sit quietly in the corner, sketching. He drew images from dreams, Leland beneath a canopy of bamboo, faces half remembered from the war, the shape of helicopters overhead. Some days, younger veterans approached him to talk, and Harold always listened with patience. But he rarely offered his own story. To him, the war was a private ache, not something for public display. His house, too, had become a museum of sorts. Not grand or curated, but a place where time lingered. Old military jackets hung beside the door. A record player sat by the window, its needle stuck in a groove that never quite played out. The shelves held not just books but relics, a compass, an old Zippo lighter engraved with the words, "For Leland, come home safe," and a worn-out deck of cards missing the ace of spades. Harold's dog, Copper, a golden retriever well into his twilight years, often lay at his feet. Copper had never met Leland, but he knew to grow silent when Harold spoke his brother's name. The dog would rest his head on Harold's boot and wait. In that small gesture, Harold felt he wasn't alone. It was a quiet evening when the phone rang. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue across the kitchen floor. Harold hesitated before picking up. On the other end was Dr. Emmett Voss, a military historian stationed in Louisiana, his voice a mix of professionalism and awe. "Mr. Rowe," he said, "an archaeological team working near an old battle site in Southeast Asia found remains we believe could be your brothers." The words hit Harold like a jolt. His heart stuttered, his breath caught. He closed his eyes as the memories surged, the uniforms, the telegram, the funeral that never happened. Dr. Voss explained that fragments of bone and personal items were found in an area previously inaccessible due to terrain and conflict. A rusted dog tag. A necklace. Possibly even an unsent letter. They were reaching out to families of soldiers listed as MIA, missing in action. Leland was one of them. After the call ended, Harold sat in silence for hours. The world outside turned to night, but he remained unmoving, one hand still holding the receiver. That night, he didn't sleep. He opened the trunk in his closet, the one he hadn't touched in decades, and spread its contents across the floor: old letters, medals, a black and white photograph of two boys fishing near a creek. Harold whispered to the past, "Maybe it's time." It was a quiet evening when the phone rang. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue across the kitchen floor. Harold hesitated before picking up. On the other end was Dr. Emmett Voss, a military historian stationed in Louisiana, his voice a mix of professionalism and awe. "Mr. Rowe," he said, "an archaeological team working near an old battle site in Southeast Asia found remains we believe could be your brothers." The words hit Harold like a jolt. His heart stuttered, his breath caught. He closed his eyes as the memories surged: the uniforms, the telegram, the funeral that never happened. Dr. Voss explained that fragments of bone and personal items were found in an area previously inaccessible due to terrain and conflict. A rusted dog tag. A necklace. Possibly even an unsent letter. They were reaching out to families of soldiers listed as MIA, missing in action. Leland was one of them. After the call ended, Harold sat in silence for hours. The world outside turned to night, but he remained unmoving, one hand still holding the receiver. That night, he didn't sleep. He opened the trunk in his closet, the one he hadn't touched in decades, and spread its contents across the floor: old letters, medals, a black and white photograph of two boys fishing near a creek. Harold whispered to the past, "Maybe it's time." Harold made the decision within days. He contacted Dr. Voss again and asked for all available documentation. The historian promised to send over every declassified report and connect Harold with someone from the National Archives who could assist further. That person turned out to be Lisa Chen. Lisa was a bright-eyed young archivist in her late 20s, driven by both professional curiosity and personal loss. Her grandfather had gone missing during the same war and had never been found. She understood Harold's silence, his pauses, his hesitation. Over long phone calls and later in-person meetings, she helped Harold navigate the complex maze of military records, inside the archives. Surrounded by metal cabinets and the smell of dust and ink, they began piecing together a picture that had never been publicly acknowledged. Operation Seeker's Edge. Platoon 7. A last-minute reroute into a dense forest. An ambush. The official report claimed Leland had died in an explosion, body unrecovered. But eyewitness accounts in an overlooked dossier told another tale, that a young soldier had shielded several comrades before falling to enemy fire. His name was never mentioned, but Lisa and Harold grew more certain: it was Leland. They found letters from surviving soldiers, names redacted, some handwritten in shaky script. One note read, "The young one didn't scream. He stood. Just stood there, protecting the rest of us. I see his face in my dreams." Another simply said, "The boy from Kansas was a hero." As more fragments of the truth surfaced, Harold felt both heartbreak and vindication. His brother hadn't just vanished, he had made a final stand. Lisa, watching the old veteran's eyes fill with tears, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "We'll bring him home the way he deserves." The day Harold boarded the plane to Southeast Asia, the Kansas wind whispered behind him like a farewell from the past. He carried little more than a small duffel bag, the photo of his brother, and a worn letter from the Department of Defense. Lisa Chen met him at the airport, her backpack filled with maps, documentation, and a voice recorder. The two of them looked like an unlikely pair, an aging soldier and a modern-day archivist, but together, they were retracing history's forgotten footprints. In Vietnam, they were greeted by General Nguyen Van Minh, a retired officer with sharp eyes and a dignified bearing. He spoke fluent English, his words marked by a calm gravitas. In a quiet room adorned with old maps and photographs, He recounted the story of a battle few outside his circle had ever known. There were American soldiers caught in the jungle. My unit watched from afar. Most reports said they died quickly. But there was one, a young man who refused to run. He pulled others into cover, took the fire himself. We later found the place. His body was missing, but signs were left behind. As men guided them through the terrain, Harold was overwhelmed by the scent of the forest, damp earth, rotting leaves, and bamboo rustling in the wind. The team trekked for hours into dense foliage, their clothes soaked in sweat, until they reached a clearing. There, a flag marked the site where remains had been discovered. A local team of archaeologists, along with American specialists, had been carefully excavating the area. Harold stood back as they uncovered a rusted dog tag. When they handed it to him, his fingers shook. Leland Row. The letters were faded but unmistakable. Harold collapsed to his knees. Time folded in on itself. He was no longer a gray-haired man in a foreign land, he was an older brother, holding the last physical proof of a promise unbroken. The steady patter of rain filled the air as the excavation continued. The heavy drops drummed on the tarp above the site, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the passage of time. Technicians worked with the precision of surgeons, brushing away soil and debris from the bones that had been hidden for decades. Among the scattered remains, they uncovered the dog tag, small pieces of bone, and something far more personal, a locket containing a faded photograph of their parents. The sight of it made Harold's heart ache with a depth he could not articulate. The faces in the photograph were those of young people, smiling under the bright sun of another era. It was a reminder of a time before the war. Before the pain. Then, as the archaeologists continued their work, one of them uncovered a brittle piece of paper. Carefully sealed in a plastic bag, it was an unsent letter, its ink smudged by time and water. When Harold was handed the letter, his hands shook as he gingerly unfolded it. The words were faded, but enough remained to make out the message: "Dear Harold, if I don't make it back, please keep your promise to Mama. Don't let her forget me. Tell her I was brave. Tell her I thought of you all." The words struck Harold like a blow to the chest. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, his heart breaking in a way he hadn't thought was possible. The rain fell softly around him. And Lisa knelt beside him, placing a hand on his back. The words were not just a letter, they were a message across time, a cry from a brother who had died with a promise unfulfilled. The flight back to Kansas was a blur for Harold. He sat by the window, the sky below filled with thick clouds, as if the world itself was mourning. As the plane soared through the air, Harold clutched the letter in his hands, the words printed in fading ink a constant reminder of the promise he had made to his mother. He had failed in keeping that promise for so many years, but now, he was finally bringing Leland home. "Mama," Harold whispered softly to himself as he stared out at the clouds, "I've brought him home." The plane touched down in Kansas under a gray sky. There was no fanfare, no military procession, just the quiet anticipation of a long-awaited return. A military vehicle awaited him on the tarmac. Not for ceremony but for respect. Lisa, ever at his side, offered him a small, silent comfort. Together, they drove to the Kansas Veterans Cemetery, where arrangements had already been made. Harold asked for no parade, no speeches, no grand displays, just family, friends, and the peace of a final rest. On the morning of the funeral, the town stirred early, not because of any grand ceremony, but because something sacred was unfolding. The urn, containing Leland's remains, rested on a simple cedar table beside a photo of Leland in his military uniform. Next to the table was a sign Harold had written, "Thank you for living for what was right." Only a handful of people were invited, a few neighbors, veterans who remembered Leland, and Lisa, who had flown in once more to pay her respects. Harold stood before them, a man with tears in his eyes and a heavy heart, but he was not lost. He had come home, not just physically, but emotionally, to fulfill the promise he had made so long ago. He gave a short eulogy, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He was my brother, yes, but he was more than that. He was my friend. And he wasn't a hero because of the uniform he wore. He was a hero because he chose others over himself, even when it cost him everything. A local boy played taps, the sound of the bugle carrying across the cemetery, a haunting melody that filled the air. No flyovers, no guns, just the quiet reverence of a final farewell. Afterward, Harold invited everyone to his house for lemonade and pie, just as their mother had done for so many years. It was a simple gathering, but one that felt right, a fitting tribute to a man who had never asked for fame. That evening, after the guests had left, Harold returned to the cemetery. The night was still, the stars twinkling in the vast Kansas sky. He sat beside the grave, the wind whispering through the trees. It was here, alone, that Harold finally felt the weight of the years lift from his shoulders. He spoke to Leland, not as a ghost, but as a brother. "You remember that time you crashed the bike and Mama scolded me? Or how you always sneaked a piece of peach pie when she wasn't looking?" He chuckled softly, a tear slipping down his cheek. Copper, the old dog who had been with him through the years, lay beside him. For the first time in 50 years, Harold felt light. He wasn't healed, but he was whole, as though the puzzle pieces of his life had finally clicked together. Leland was home, and that was enough. Lisa's suggestion to create an archive for the families of lost soldiers was the beginning of something larger than Harold had expected. Together, they started a community project they called the Promise Project. They began gathering letters, photographs, and artifacts from families who, like Harold, had never received closure. Within months, their efforts blossomed into a movement that spanned across the nation. One letter stood out in particular. It was from Jorge Martinez, a soldier who had survived the same battle where Leland had died. The letter read, "I don't know his name, but a young man pushed me down just as the bullets came. He saved my life. I've never forgotten him." When Jorge saw a photograph of Leland, his face crumpled with emotion. "That's him," he said, tears filling his eyes. "That's the one." Harold sent Jorge a copy of Leland's final letter, and the two men, forever connected by courage, shared a bond that neither time nor distance could break. Back in Kansas, Harold returned to the solace of his garden. He planted carrots, sunflowers, and squash, all the things Leland had loved as a child. He carved a sign at the edge of the field, his hands steady despite the years of hard work, "Leland's Field, where heroes come home." The field became a place of peace, not a monument, but something living. Children from the town began visiting. They would sit with Harold as he told stories, not about war, but about laughter, childhood, and brotherhood. He taught them to plant, to listen, and to remember. One autumn afternoon, Harold was invited to speak at the local school. He wore his best coat and carried a small photo of Leland, tucked carefully into his jacket pocket. Standing before the students, he shared his brother's story. "My brother wasn't famous. He didn't win medals. But he did something more important, he gave someone else a chance to live. That's courage. That's love." The room was silent. No one fidgeted, no one whispered. A young girl raised her hand. "Mr. Harold, I'll tell your story to my children." He smiled. "That's all I could ever ask." And the years that followed, Harold wrote a memoir titled The Soldier and the Unbroken Promise. On the last page, he penned his final thoughts: "The war took my brother, but it also gave me the meaning of life. I am no longer a soldier. I am a storyteller. And as long as the story is told, Leland will never truly be gone. On the table beside him lay a photograph of two young boys, side by a creek, their faces alight with joy. Forever young, lesson learned, don't forget those who went before us. In the end, Harold's story was not just about war, but about promises, redemption, kindness, and the priceless value of being remembered as a human being. The fallen soldiers don't need statues, they need someone to tell their real story. And you, the reader, could be the one to keep that flame alive.